Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm Jonathan Krasner. I'm a core faculty member at the Mandel Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this ongoing series of conversations with scholars of Jewish education. We created this series as a way to share scholarship in the field of Jewish education with a broad audience of educators and Jewish leaders. At the Mandel Center, we're committed to developing and promoting scholarship in Jewish education, especially scholarship on teaching and learning in Jewish education, in order to make a deep and lasting difference in the lives of learners and the vibrancy of the Jewish community. That's our mission. Today's session and our other events help us to serve our mission by getting important ideas out in the world. We encourage you to take a look at the Mandel Center events page to see the rest of our upcoming events. And we'll have a link to that in the chat. We're delighted to have so many of you join us, and we hope to take some of your questions as we go. So feel free to post those questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We're also recording today's session. We'll make the recording available afterwards on our website for those who couldn't join us today. But the recording will only capture the presenters, not the audience. Today's guest is Shaul Kelner, Associate Professor of Sociology and Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University, and also happens to be the program coordinator for the Mandel Center's Senior Fellows Program. Shaul is the author of a wonderful book on Birthright Israel called Tours That Bind, but today we're here to talk about his new book, A Cold War Exodus: How American Activists Mobilized to Free Soviet Jews. Shaul, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you, Jonathan. Thank you to the Mandel Center.
Great. Well, let's start with the backstory to this book. Tell us how it is that you came to write this book.
So I started writing this book actually as a graduate school paper in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was a class on religious protest movements. And I was at City University taking the class through the consortium at Columbia. And since I was already traveling uptown on the 1 and 9 train, there was still a 9 train back then, I just continued further uptown to the archives at Yeshiva University. And I started writing about student struggle for Soviet Jewry and how Soviet Jewry activists mobilized the Passover holiday. And from there, this was always a back burner project for me over the next 10, 15 years, but I kept coming back to it. I fell in love with it. And when I decided to make it a book project in like 2013, 14, I went well beyond looking at Passover, holiday ritual, to all of the different ways that activists mobilized culture to engage American Jews in the struggle to free Soviet Jewry.
Great. Tell me a little bit about your methodology. Like you said, you were in the archives. What were you doing? What were you looking for? And tell me a little bit how you analyzed what you found.
Yeah, certainly. So I decided I used archival research, which I supplemented with oral history interviews with activists. There is a lot of nostalgia surrounding the Soviet Jewry movement, and I was interested not in the collective memory of the movement, but how activists actually developed their tactics. And for that, talking to people, 30, 40, 50 years later wasn't going to give me the answers I was looking for. I needed to trace through time in the documents how tactics that in retrospect just seem to be part of the movement, like bar and bat mitzvah twinning or raising a matzah of hope, how these things actually developed. And the only way to figure that out was to go back in time and see in the documents themselves how the planning happened, who was inventing these tactics, what the alternatives were that they were considering that they rejected, and as these tactics were first created, how did they then evolve and how did they spread? So I really was document focused. The interviews supplemented and fleshed out some of the details.
Great. You mentioned the matzah of hope before, and if we think about education in the broadest sense, I think probably for a lot of people who were boomers or silent generation, they may have been introduced to the Soviet Jewry movement through the matzah of hope. Why don't you tell us like what you found out about like the origins of that and how it was used as I guess a community building tool, educational tool, like what tell us all about it.
Yeah, so the Matzah of Hope was a Seder supplement that was written by the American Jewish Conference for Soviet Jewry in the mid-1960s, and then got disseminated nationwide and became a part of a lot of American seders, where at the time when speaking about the matzah, the leader of the seder would raise it could be a fourth matzah. They would raise a matzah and they would say, "This is the matzah of hope." And we know that our brothers in the Soviet Union are not free. They're not free to leave. They're not free to teach their children. They're not free to to express their religion. And we use the Passover ritual to tell the story of a present day oppression and a hope for a modern day exodus. So the connection between Passover and the Soviet Jewry movement in retrospect seemed like it was totally natural. Let my people go, exodus. But when this ritual was first developed, they called it the matzah of oppression. They then renamed it to the more hopeful matzah of hope. And when they first created it, they did not mention anything about exodus and about Soviet Jews not being free to leave. That only came about, they only added that language in the late 60s, early 70s, once Soviet Jews themselves began demanding their right to leave, and those demands filtered out to the West. And at that point, American Jews decided, okay, we can call for exodus. There was a split in the movement over whether to call for exodus or just for religious rights in the Soviet Union. But just the notion that a ritual at Passover about Soviet Jewry is not going to call for exodus, that's the counterintuitive thing that you can only find that out by looking back in the documents and saying, whoa, there was a time when American Jews were afraid to say, let my people go.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Of course, I guess in the late 60s was also the time where you began to see refuseniks and begin to put names to faces and all of that, so that it really made it not just some kind of amorphous issue, but really a human issue with real people. Was that part of the impetus
Yes,
for?
absolutely. I think the key tactical shift in mobilizing American Jews for Soviet Jewry came about in 68, 69, 70, when they shifted from talking about Soviet Jewry in the abstract, this collective noun. Could you name a Soviet Jew? No one could. To specific campaigns for named individuals. So Boris Kochubievsky is the first political prisoner whose name is known in the West as an activist for Soviet Jewry and who people rally around. And with this shift to advocating for named people, you get all these things like wearing bracelets with the names of political prisoners, bar and bat mitzvah twinning that matched American Jewish 13-year-olds with known children of refuseniks, 12 and 13-year-olds in the Soviet Union, adoption, tourism to go visit refuseniks. Back in the early 60s, when American Jewish activists first started mobilizing, they didn't know who Soviet Jews were. They couldn't really connect in that personal way.
Great. So let's kind of take more of a 30,000-foot view for a second. What would you say is the overarching argument that you're making in the book?
This was a cultural movement. This is the largest mass mobilization in Jewish American history, and there was no guarantee that American Jews would be able to change Soviet policy. And the only way that American Jews managed to succeed was that they did not create this narrowly as a political campaign. They created this as a cultural mobilization so that activism for Soviet Jewry was infused into every type of Jewish organization: synagogues, schools, summer camps, federations, Jewish Family Services, Hadassah, NCJW, Jewish war veterans, you name it. And every moment of Jewish time, the holidays, the life cycle events, graduations, and every part of the Jewish population, including little children.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But well, actually, let's start with my own biography. When I was reading this book, I couldn't help but think about sort of my involvement, peripheral as it was, in the Soviet Jewry movement. I think the first memory that I have is being taken to Solidarity Sunday marches, which they used to have in New York. How did that come about?
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of people would march in New York every year for Soviet Jewry in the 1970s and 80s. And this was just a few weeks apart from the Israel Independence Day Salute to Israel rally. So American Jews were coming out twice in the spring. When they finally wrapped these things up in the late 80s, the New York Times described it as an annual New York ritual. So this, and your participation as a kid is classic, because did you choose to go? Did you say, I don't know how old you were, did you say to your parents, I want to go to the Solidarity Day rally? If you were an older kid, you might have, right? But if you were a younger kid, you're dragged along, you're taken along. Maybe your whole class is going, so you go as part of the school group. Maybe your parents are involved, so they take you. But children's involvement in this type of stuff was a combination of not voluntary and voluntary. But by going to a Solidarity Day rally as a kid, one of the things that you learn as a Jewish American child in the 1970s and 80s is that part of what being Jewish means going out into the streets, standing up and speaking out for Soviet Jewry. That's a Jewish practice. We stopped that Jewish practice, and so it's something it was important for our generation of Gen X Jews who were raised in that, but the generation after never experienced it.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Just this whole idea of mobilizing on behalf of Jews in need, being out there on the streets, whether it's at Solidarity Sunday or we used to go to protests. And like you were saying, the school actually encouraged us to go out and do the protests. I remember my principal used to say, like, don't let school get in the way of education, right? But why don't we talk a little bit about education itself? How did teachers get mobilized, and what role did teachers play in raising awareness about Soviet Jewry with their students?
I have a colleague at Vanderbilt, Dan Cornfield, who studies the labor movement and the civil rights movement, and he talks about occupational activism. And that is to say, people are engaged as activists through their professional work. So we saw this throughout the Soviet Jewry movement. We saw doctors going to the Soviet Union to do pop-up medical clinics for refuseniks. We saw lawyers doing pro bono legal aid. We saw rabbis sermonizing about Soviet Jewry. And we saw educators in Hebrew schools, in summer camps, in groups like CAGE, where they're designing curricula, saying, we are Jewish educators, and we care about this issue. How do we use our professional expertise to make a difference here? And so the way that educators do it is through education. So they designed curricula, they created classroom programs, they came together in conferences to trade ideas. The movements themselves also tried to engage the educators and to take the ideas that one teacher in one Hebrew school is producing and get this stuff disseminated outward. So at the time, and you know this much better than I, but the network of Jewish communal educational infrastructure nationwide was much more tightly knit then than it is now. So you had a teacher in a classroom who would create, for example, a popsicle stick puppet play about a Soviet Jewish refusenik family. And this stuff will get picked up by the local Board of Jewish Education, the local BJE. And then that BJE will send it to other BJEs. And then you see that then go into curricula recommendations in other communities as well.
Yeah. I mean, for the educators in the audience, this was also the time period when CAGE came about, and CAGE was definitely a place where educators would come together every year and share curriculum, share ideas. Very much, I think it's interesting. I don't know if you thought about this, but the sort of do-it-yourself ethic of the 60s and 70s and how that had an influence on what teachers were doing. I don't know. Did that come up at all for you?
Yeah, that was huge, and it was something that was puzzling to me because, for example, one of the areas where it came up was in the summer camps. So one of the popular ways that summer camps would teach American Jewish kids about the struggles of Jews in Russia trying to get an exit visa was they did simulation games. Now, they did all types of simulations about other things, but basically the whole campground is turned into the Soviet Union. The counselors are playing the KGB, and they're playing them as cartoon villains. The kids are Soviet Jews who have to run the gauntlet of a Soviet bureaucracy to get the exit visa. Maybe 1 in 10 manage to quote unquote get out. And those who do are taken on a bus to Israel where they're given chocolates, and the rest just go around and around and around in this Kafkaesque bureaucratic loop for the whole day. And now reading it here, I'm thinking, wow, this sort of sounds in some ways Stanford prison experimenty, where playing the KGB, the counselors could, if they wanted to, be harsh on the kids. But this was something that it was not just professional educators who designed these simulations. It was also the campers and the counselors themselves. And one of the very first simulations like this that was created was developed in the reform camping system at a gathering in November. So it was a winter gathering of counselors and camp educators where they were planning the curricula, and they co-designed this stuff.
Wow. I was just thinking about how if a camp counselor decided to do something like that today, they would probably get fired.
It was a different time, Jonathan.
You also talk about Soviet twinning, and let's talk about that a little bit. I have to say that I'm probably just a little too old for the twinning. I had my bar mitzvah in '79, which is I think
you're too old for it.
That it happened. Yeah. So tell me how that came about.
Yeah. So bar and bat mitzvah twinning was matching an American Jewish bar mitzvah boy, bat mitzvah girl with a child of Soviet refuseniks. It was not a one-to-one match. About 10,000 plus American Jewish kids did this, and they were matched with probably 1,000 to 2,000 Soviet Jewish kids over this period between 1981 and 1989, 90 is when it really starts to slow down because people are emigrating faster than they can be matched up with their American twins. So this began in a lot of different ways. A lot of different threads came together. So activists had been doing family adoption, prisoner adoption. That was for adults, but this was a way of connecting kids to that. They had been trying to engage kids through pen paling and letter writing, and so this builds off of that. There were some specific instances in which the tourism connection with specific families also created the first matchings. So the very first pairings happened in Philadelphia, and it was the Cindy Ivker, who's in Philly, and Natasha Korenfeld, who was in Moscow. So Natasha Korenfeld was a girl whose nervous breakdown because of threats. Her parents were refuseniks. She ended up writing a poem, and this poem was then featured in a guide to children's activism. And activists connected this girl in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, with Natasha Korenfeld. They sent each other cassette tapes of them reciting their prayers. They got press coverage for it. So from the 1975, 76, 77, you're seeing activists who are like leading activists in the States who are using their own families and their own kids, bar and bat mitzvahs, to do these pairings and getting press coverage. And that gets the idea out there. And then later it gets systematized where it's not just for activists, but it's for everyone.
Yeah, really interesting. In the book itself, you talk a little bit about the twinning and how it was so popular that there were more kids in America that wanted to be twins than there were actually refusenik kids that there were to twin, right? And in fact, just knowing kind of your story, I think you have a personal experience with something you found in the archives related to your own twinning. Why don't you tell that story?
Okay, so I grew up in central New Jersey, and I did my bar mitzvah twinning with Leonid Barras in October 1982. Leonid's father was a journalist, and he was a refusenik. I am writing letters to Leonid before the bar mitzvah, and I'm not getting any response. And in some ways, I was not supposed to get a response. That's part of the lesson. Look, American Jewish kids, how the Soviets are oppressing their Jewish communities. You're going to send letters and they're going to be censored. So I got up and I gave a speech. Now, anti-Semites, Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. And And then I go and I look in the archive when I'm doing research for this book. It's now, what, 30 years later or so. And I find that Leonid Barras was already in Jerusalem by October 1982. His family had gotten out, but twinning was so new at that point that the activists didn't have things fully coordinated. And so they were giving out names of people who had already left. And you see then later in the memos where they're talking about that that's a problem, and how they had to deal with it. But what struck me was my emotional reaction, because my reaction should have been fantastic. That's great. He was out. And while that was partly, it was also, oh man, he was my twin. I was standing up for him. What happened? So it's from something like that, that I knew this beforehand, but I'm really looking at, this is not a book about Soviet Jews. It's a book about how activism for Soviet Jewry shaped the American Jewish experience. And it was in that emotional reaction, hey, he was already out, that it's very clear. Twinning, the Soviets may or may not have known that they had twins. American Jews knew about this. It was meaningful to them for their own American Jewish reasons.
Yeah, that's related actually. I wanted to ask you about the title of the book. So the book is called A Cold War Exodus, right? And then how American activists mobilized to free Soviet Jews. Talk about the Cold War aspect. I wonder how many kids especially were aware of just how influential the Cold War was on the direction of this movement, on the politics behind the movement. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Activists in the movement framed the movement as, this is not Cold War. This is not anti-communism. This is not about regime change in the Soviet Union. Just let our people out. And that was a strategic rhetoric to ensure bipartisan support for the movement. And in a time where they thought, we're not going to be able to actually defeat the Soviet Union, but at least we may be able to save American Jews. So we have to keep this out of a Cold War context. It was a key rhetorical stance that the movement took. At the same time, when you look back at all of the movement culture, the drawings, the music, the language that's used, it is a language of freedom, of American freedom. And going back to the DII aspects also, the bar and bat mitzvah kids would often make their own prayer booklets, and they would decorate them themselves. And the way that they would decorate them would be hammer and sickles with chains, Jewish stars chained to them. So a lot of imagery that was Soviet Union as an oppressive prison, bar and bat mitzvah twinning sermons about, until I knew my Soviet Jewish twin, I didn't appreciate what freedom was, and now I pray for freedom for Soviet Jews too, amen. So this is really, it's a Cold War language. It's an American language. It goes to this notion of, and this is a notion that Jonathan Sarna and others have talked about, a cult of synthesis, that our Americanness and our Jewishness go together. And to be advocating for Soviet Jews and fighting the Soviet Union during the Cold War, what could be more American than that?
Yeah. And is that why you chose that title, or what was your thinking about that?
I had lots and lots of different titles. I wanted Cold War to be in there, and I wanted Exodus to be in there. The movement succeeded by engaging Jews with the most timeless aspects of their religion. This is core narrative. Let my people go, Exodus. And the most timely, this was the defining conflict in the world at the time. And so Jews, at the same time they were doing the timeless, they were also doing the most timely. The people who were going into the Soviet Union to help refuseniks, they were literally, and by literally I mean literally, not figuratively, dodging the KGB. They were being tailed, and they really did take evasive actions to avoid them. So what other Americans had that opportunity to fight the Cold War in that way? Most would watch James Bond movies, but American Jews were actually trying to smuggle religious items into the Soviet Union, were getting harassed by Soviet police. So it was very much a Cold War experience.
How aware in your research, how aware were the leaders of the movement, whether it was the Union of Councils or SSJ, how aware were they that this was really a movement to like solidify American Jewish identity. And, and that really, in many ways, was more of going to have more of an impact than anything that the Soviet Union might or might not know about what's going on.
It's hard to know. Jacob Birnbaum, who was the founder of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, he in his own mind was explicit that this was also that in mobilizing to save Soviet Jewry, American Jewry would save itself, would become revitalized with a new passion. But other activists, that was not their main goal. Their main goal was freeing Soviet Jews. And I think about it in terms of Viktor Frankl and the pursuit of meaning, that you can't pursue love, or you can't pursue meaning. Like, love does not, how does he, well, I forget what the exact quote is. It is the side effect of pursuing meaningful action. Meaning is a side effect of committing to something. Love is the side effect of engaging in actions that create a relationship. If you're going, I'm going to find love, I'm going to find meaning, it doesn't work. These people had a mission. The mission was not to do anything for American Jews. It was to save Soviet Jewry. And that focus in and of itself was inspiring. Think about what happened when the movement ended. Soviet Union collapses, Soviet Jewry are freed, and American Jews stop mobilizing. And then what do we get? The continuity crisis. Right. There's a dearth of meaning. We don't know what we're supposed to do. We don't know what things are about.
Yeah, and so you're seeing an explicit relationship between the end of the movement and the continuity crisis. I mean, obviously, it's not the only issue.
Not the only thing. It created a context in which American Jews could turn data about intermarriage into a full-blown crisis and really fret about it. They could have responded to the 1990 population survey in different ways, but the 1990 population survey comes at a time when anchors of meaning were already being shaken up. The end of the Soviet Jewry movement was one. And the move toward a peace process in Israel was other. Because we are rallying to save Soviet Jewry. We're rallying to protect an Israel at threat. Israel seems to be at peace. We're not rallying to save Soviet Jewry. What are we doing? What are we about?
Yeah, and unfortunately now we're in a much darker moment.
There you go. Okay.
But let me add, let's end. I can't believe it's already almost time to end, but let's end on, I don't know, maybe if not a more hopeful note, at least a looking forward note. When people read this book, what do you want them to come away with in terms of, to the extent, I know that as an academic, academics, we don't necessarily want to teach lessons per se, but what are you hoping that people come away with from this book?
It depends on which readers. For people who are on this webinar who are probably thinking about issues related to Jewish education, I would want them to really think about Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will understand, and Shema, the Shema prayer, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will understand. The ethos that came with the Soviet Jewry movement, I don't think that it preceded the movement. I think the movement engaged people. It got them doing things that were creating a sense of Jewish ethnic solidarity, and that it's a mitzvah, a religious obligation to stand up and speak out for Jews in distress, no matter where they are. And once those actions stopped, that ethos dissipated. The actions produced the meaning. We do and we will understand. It's not nishma v'na'aseh. It's not we will understand and then we will do. The action comes first. It's one. The second thing with Shema, and this is really the V'ahavta paragraph, it's a recipe for a community-wide mobilization. When and where can you mobilize? If you want to create a total cultural mobilization, when you're sitting in your house, when you're walking by the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. And by the way, anyone who's wearing the jewelry now for the hostages being held in Gaza and is thinking back to the bracelets for Soviet Jewry prisoners of conscience or the medallions that were worn back then, you go to sleep at night and you take the jewelry off. You wake up in the morning, you put it on. And in those very mundane moments, you are thinking about the cause, you're thinking about the issue. So it brings it into a very personal, intimate moment. And so the Soviet Jewry movement, the Shema prayer, the Ahavta, really gives you the recipe for where you can mobilize. And of course, Vishinantam livanecha, teach them diligently to thy children. And they mobilize the entire Jewish educational apparatus to do that.
Great. Well, this was really a lot of fun. I want to encourage everyone to get the book, to buy the book, to steal the book. No, don't steal the book.
There's
I
a
believe,
discount code. They can get it for a
yeah,
steal.
Liz put a discount code in the chat, and maybe for people who came a little late, Liz, you could do that again, so that they can buy a discounted version directly from NYU, or of course, it's available at all of your favorite online booksellers. I just wanted to let everybody know that this series, Learning About Learning, will be continuing. We have on October 10th, how educators can overcome barriers to engaging with the conflict. And we all know what conflict we're talking about there, with Karen Freeman. We also have a spotlight session on Jewish education after October 7th coming up on October 31st. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to encourage everyone to check out the Mandel Center events page, where you can find videos of our past events, and see what we're doing. And most of all, I just want to thank you, Shaul, for spending the time with us today, giving us a little bit of a taste of this wonderful new book.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.